Okay, so we're finishing off chapter 19. We're talking about exchange rates, interest rates, NX and NCO. We're talking about an open economy in general. And where we left off last video was we're talking about the how a budget deficit affects a trade deficit. And we saw that these two things go in opposite directions. Whenever we widen the budget deficit, we increase our net export, or sorry, our net exports widens as well. So that means our exports increase. Sorry, our net exports decrease. That means that we import more and we export less. But point is that an increase in a budget deficit increases our trade deficit, right? The less money the government has to spend, the wider net exports get. Okay, so here we saw that the effect of a budget deficit, that means that national savings falls. The reason being is because, well, we're running a deficit, right? A deficit means that we don't have any money, and that by definition says that our savings falls. And we can see that by the effect of the loanable funds market when we did this example. And then we saw that by national savings falling, real interest rate rises. So this is, again, all from the loanable funds graph, which is the first graph in our example. And then we saw that, well, if the interest rate rises, that means that domestic investment and net capital outflow both fall. Domestic investment falls because, well, interest rates are higher. I don't want to invest anymore because I used to be the 3%, now it's 5%. Maybe I'm not going to take out that loan. And same thing with net capital outflow, both falls. Well, why would you want to go buy foreign assets when the interest rate here in the US is quite high, right? Interest rates is rise. So that means that net capital outflow both falls. We know that when net capital outflow falls, the real exchange rate appreciates. Well, before we go here, let's actually talk about net exports, because we know that NCO equal NX. If net capital outflow equals net exports, and we just said that net capital outflow has fallen, well, therefore, then definitely net exports has fallen as well. So this is an easy result to come to. Now, we know that the real exchange rate appreciates from the graph that we looked at last class or last video, where we saw that when we have a change in net capital outflow, how that affects the exchange rate. And we'll see that in just a minute. Okay. So here we're going to see that who owes who? Does the US owe the rest of the world? Does the rest of the world owe the US? And what we can see here is that the US owns 28 trillion of foreign assets, whereas the rest of the world owns 38 trillion of American assets. So if we take the net of these two, we subtract these two out, we end up getting $10.5 trillion, and that's going to be US debt to the rest of the world. That means that that the US owes about 10 trillion to the rest of the world rather than vice versa. Okay. So let's not forget, this is why I told you to draw these two graphs on top of each other. Remember, I want this to be an inverted L. I'd like on this side over here to be the loanable funds market, which determines some R, and the R gets fed into this graph over here, where we have a change in R, changes my NCO. And that's why I said to draw this graph under NCO, because now you can see that, well, if R used to be here, that gives me an NCO equal to here, which gives me a net exports equal to here. So that's why when you draw these two things above each other, you can just completely just drop down, oh, NCO is here, given some R, well, you keep on dropping it down all the way down to net exports. And say, well, okay, well, this is going to be my NCO, this is going to be my supply, into the foreign exchange market. Remember, what market is this? This is going to be the foreign exchange market that determines some exchange rate. And then now, when we say, well, the interest rate went from R1 to R2, that changed my NCO. And as a result, whoop, I bring this straight down, and now I've got my new supply curve. And at my new supply curve, demand hasn't changed. What happens? We have a new exchange rate. And you can think about it this way. Well, when the interest rate went up, the NCO went down because no one wants to buy foreign assets anymore. American assets are pretty attractive with this new interest rate. And as a result, the supply of dollars in the foreign exchange market decreased because we're now not willing to trade any dollars for German assets or Japanese assets because, well, American assets are pretty attractive. So that means that there are less dollars now floating around in the foreign exchange market. And as a result, the exchange rate goes up. The exchange rate goes up because the rest of the world are trying to get some dollars so they can buy Apple laptops and Tesla cars, but they can't find those dollars because there's no supply. There's the NCO has decreased because of an increase in R. Okay. So keep in mind the the loanable funds market, that's going to be not shown, that determines R, and that's going to be right here. That's why I want them to be kind of inverted L, because you can determine what happens in the loanable funds market over here. That gives you some R, which is on the y-axis, and you can kind of feed that R straight in, just like we fed the NCO over here, right? You can feed in the R as well from the loanable funds market. Okay, so this R determines the NCO, that's right here. So R is given, and that gives us some NCO, and then the NCO comes in and gives us the supply side of this graph, which determines our nominal exchange rate. Okay, so let's do some examples. Let's say that the government provides a new tax incentive to encourage investment. So now we have investment is a little bit more attractive because of this tax incentive. So we're going to see how this would affect through our graph. So let's start with the first two. These are going to be the two on top. Remember, you draw the loanable funds, then net capital outflow to the right, and then below net capital outflow over here, I want that last graph, which is the foreign exchange graph. Okay, so let's start. Yeah, so now we're going to do, so we have an investment. Investment's more attractive because of that tax incentive. If investment is more attractive, that means that D here, this is my investment curve. Remember, S is savings, D is I plus NCO, right? I is domestic investment, NCO is net capital outflow, and we're saying that now domestic investment is more attractive. So there's an increase in demand for domestic investment because D is I and NCO, and we're going to say, well, NCO didn't change, but I did, right? And domestic investment is more attractive, so I'm going to increase my demand for investment. As a result, what happens? The equilibrium interest rate rises, right? Because, well, demand increased, but there's not, supply hasn't increased, supply is still the same, and as a result we're going to have an increase in interest rate to balance the increase in demand and non-increase in supply. So we have an increase in the interest rate, so that feeds into our net capital outflow graph. Remember, that's why I want these two left and right or side by side, because once I determine what the interest rate is from over here, I can feed that interest rate straight into my net capital outflow graph, and I can say, well, given the interest rate that was determined by this marker over here, well, how is that going to affect net capital outflow? Well, if interest rates went up, well, net capital outflow will go down. The reason being is because American assets are more attractive. Why should I go and buy German or Japanese assets when American assets pay out so much? As a result, net capital outflow goes down. We supplied less dollars to the rest of the world because we'd like to keep our dollars to ourselves. They produce such a high rate of return. Now we come down to the graph that is below this graph, right? So right over here is going to be this graph. You can see that over here we had a decrease in NCO. It started off over here and now we went to this lower level. That's why over here we're going to draw it as a decrease in NCO, and that's why you'd have this graph right up here. And we say that, well, if the supply of dollars into the foreign exchange went down, decreased, well, that means that the exchange rate will go up. The exchange rate appreciates. And the idea here is that, well, there's just not that many dollars floating around in order for the Japanese or the Germans or any other foreign country to buy dollars and go out and buy American laptops or American cars with. They're not finding those dollars because Americans are not supplying those dollars. They're not supplying those dollars because, well, the interest rate in the US, the interest rate in the US is quite high. It's a high interest rate, and that's nice. And as a result, I'm not going to supply dollars into the foreign exchange market because I want to keep my dollars to myself. They produce such a high rate of return. Why would I give it to you? And as a result, the exchange rate goes up because there's a less supply of dollars around. Okay. So we saw how how the effect of an investment incentive has. First of all, we saw that R rises and led to a fall in net capital outflow, which led to a fall in net export. So immediately, whenever whatever happens to NCO will happen to NX, and if NX falls, then we know that E rises as well from the graph. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about trade policy. Trade policy is going to be government policy that influences trade, influences the quantity of goods and services that we import and export. And there's really two policies that we can play with: tariffs and quotas. Tariffs are just going to be a tax on imported goods. So if we were going to say, well, I want to encourage American manufacturing, then let's put a tariff on Chinese manufactured goods, and then as a result, Chinese manufactured goods are more expensive, and Americans won't buy them as much. So that's one way of using trade policy. Another example is import quota, saying that, well, you know what, we've got too much Toyotas in the world or in the US, and as a result, we're going to limit the quantity of Toyotas. We're going to say that only 1 million Toyotas come in per year, and the rest are just now Chevys and Fords. Okay. So why should we ever restrict trade? Well, we want to say that we want to save some American jobs. We want to save American manufacturing jobs, American auto jobs, and as a result, it would make sense to do some of these things. But also, we want to reduce the trade deficit as well. We don't want to continually buy foreign cars and foreign goods. We'd like to reduce our trade deficit. So sometimes we argue for a restriction of trade. All right, so let's say that the government uses an import quota on cars imported from Japan. So this works out quite well, Toyotas, in order to project jobs for the domestic auto industry. So let's see how this would affect those graphs. So first of all, we come here to the loanable funds and net capital outflow market, and we start to think that, well, an import quota doesn't really affect saving or investment, so it doesn't affect NCO, right? Because there's no change in either the loanable funds market or the net capital. There's no change in savings. There's no change in demand for investment or net capital. So there's nothing that changed here from an import quota. However, what does change is going to be our net exports, right? Because an import quota says that we're going to decrease our imports. If we decrease our imports, that boosts our net exports, right? And as a result, that exports shift to the right. Now notice that this increases our exchange rate immediately from the graph. We can see that. And net exports does not change at all. Notice that net exports is equal to NCO, right? NCO equals net exports, and net exports is on this x-axis over here. So net exports hasn't changed at all. The only thing that's changed is the exchange rate. The exchange rate just appreciated, which is not good for the US, right? To say that we're going to oppose this import quota just increases the exchange rate without changing NX, right? So that means that the exchange rate just shifted without changing anything on the real side. So an import quota does not affect net capital outflow, and we just changed E. So therefore, a policy of restricting imports does not reduce the trade deficit. We saw that now that an importing or imposing a quota did nothing to reduce the trade deficit. NX was completely unaffected by the trade policy, and the only thing that happened was an increase in the exchange rate, which is not good for the US or not good for any country particularly. So, so this policy was not a good policy. Okay. Now we could think of, for example, the job argument to say that, well, you know, if we if we put an import quota on Toyotas, we're essentially saving Ford and Chevy. We're saving the Michigan auto industry, and that's good. However, we just saw that if E rises, that's true, and that is true. We would be protecting the U.S. automaker, and they would do a little better. However, since we saw that the exchange rate rises, we actually hurt a lot of other industry, and that means other export industries contract. So, for example, if we export any agriculture, if we export any textiles or intellectual property or anything else that's not auto, will definitely take a hit because the exchange rate is higher. People will buy less American agricultural goods because the exchange rate is higher. If the exchange rate is higher, that means that Germans or Mexicans need to exchange more of their pesos because of the that is higher, in order to buy the same amount of American goods, and so therefore they're going to buy less goods because the exchange rate is higher. So the import quota does, in fact, save jobs in the auto industry, great, but it destroys jobs in other U.S. export industries, and that is all coming from the fact that the exchange rate is higher. If the exchange rate is higher, the rest of the world is going to buy less of everything else. They're going to buy less agricultural goods, less textile goods, less maybe technology goods, Apple computers, because of the hike in exchange rate. So let's look at some examples. In fact, the 90s was a pretty wild time in terms of political instability and capital flight. There was a lot of sovereign default. So if you ever want to read about that, there was the Argentina, Mexico, Russia, Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, all defaulted on sovereign debt, and that created a lot of political instability and capital flight. What does capital flight mean? That means that if you have some money in Vietnam right now, you said that you might want to invest in some stocks or bonds in Vietnam, and you hear that Vietnam is defaulting, or they're going through some turmoil, or they're going through some political instability. Well, you might want to fly your capital away, capital flight. You might want to go take your money out of Vietnam and put it into somewhere else, put it in somewhere safe, put it in the U.S., put it into some, non-politically unstable country. So that's what capital flight means. That means that when things go sour, when things go bad, people tend to pull their money out of a given country. And that happened, of course, in the 90s a lot, in Mexico, Argentina, Russia, and some Southeast Asian countries as well. So that means that political instability in Mexico made world financial markets nervous. People worried about the safety of Mexican assets they owned, and they sold many of these assets, pulled their capital out of Mexico. Okay. So we're going to see how does that affect an economy through this loanable funds, net capital outflow example. So first of all, capital flight from Mexico. What does that affect? Well, first of all, we're talking about capital flight, so definitely net capital outflow. That's saying that at the same interest rate, I'm now going to increase my NCO because there's literally capital flight, net capital outflow. So people are pulling their assets out, NCO increases without any change in R. Notice that the interest rate is still the same, and because of political instability, because we're a little afraid to keep our money in Thailand or in Mexico, net capital outflow increases. Okay? But we know that demand, this D curve right here, has two components. It has domestic investment, I, and it has NCO as foreign investment. So this demand curve is not just domestic investment, it's also domestic and foreign investment or foreign purchases, really. So we know that, hey, if NCO increased and NCO is baked into D, well, we have an increase in D as well. And if that's the case, we know that we have a new equilibrium interest rate, this new R2. And as a result, we kind of port that in over here. We say, all right, well, R2 changed. So that means that NCO is a little bit higher. And then we come to the graph below it. And we said, well, if NCO has increased, then therefore, here it is. That's that increase in NCO. And what does that do? Well, that brings down our equilibrium exchange rate. So the real exchange rate of the peso falls. Okay, so this is one example of Mexico. And the reason being is because, well, everyone is trying to sell their pesos. Everyone's trying to get out of pesos. And that's why we have an increase in S. No one wants to hold pesos anymore. And that's why the exchange rate fell, because no one wants to hold pesos. There's so much supply of these Mexican pesos because nobody wants them anymore because of this political instability. And if there's this huge supply, well, that means that the exchange rate is just going to fall dramatically. And then here we see the exchange rate of peso per dollar, US dollar per peso, and up until political instability in the 90s, you see the exchange rate fall. Okay. Here are some of the Southeast Asian countries that I mentioned. We've got South Korea, we've got Thailand, and we've got Indonesia. Um, and you can see that around the late 90s, when all this happened, the exchange rate went down because of capital flight, because of political instability and a little fear in the market. And here's the last one, Russia in 1998. So the 90s was a pretty wild time in terms of international debt markets. Okay. Oh, and Argentina is another good example, which followed in early 2000s. Okay, so to finish off this section, actually, it's not just a chapter; it's chapter 18 and 19 about international trade. I want you to note that first of all, NX equals NCO, right? We already know that. And second of all, I need you to understand the market for loanable funds and how that supply is savings and demand is investment plus net capital outflow, and how those determine our real interest rate, and then use the model that we developed in this section, where you have the loanable funds market and the NCO market next to each other, side by side, and below the NCO market is the foreign exchange market, and use that model of determining how different shocks to the economy changes the outcome. Okay. Okie doke. All right. So we'll see you next week for chapter 20. Thanks.